delighted to be here. I'm delighted to hear the perspectives of all of you. And so Valuing Voices began about 10 years ago after I'd been working in development for 25 years, when I realized, working at a huge aid donor, when I asked who evaluates the sustainability of projects, and the head of monitoring and evaluation at USAID said no one. And I was so flabbergasted, I didn't believe her. So I went and I looked and I searched for a couple of years, doing other consulting on food security and livelihoods. And I found out someone does. The Japanese, JICA, has done 2,500 evaluations of sustainability. But actually, virtually no one looks at what emerged from local efforts to sustain things after donors go home. So Sanjeev has asked me to talk about this in particular. So what is ex post evaluation? So it's sustainability is the continuation of benefits from a development intervention after major development assistance has been completed, and the resilience to risk of the net benefit flows over time. So a lot of this involves handing over to you folks in the room. Yeah. So there are lots of assumptions made, and there's not always very good listening from the side of the donors. So, but this is actually a relatively good result, because we always assume that our projects will last forever. Sanjeev has brilliantly written on trajectories, and he refers to Michael's work, but I know Sanjeev's work better, and April's, in terms of looking at, don't assume that trajectories will be positive. And so the midterm evaluation of this Nepal project to the Post project 8 years ago, they found that only 2/3 of the village savings and banks were sustained. But the very unexpected piece to this is that 10% were new village banks. And the reason this happened was not that any donor came around and handed out registers and trained people, but the communities were asking for this. Those that had been trained by the project went and taught others about and did self-help. There are really 6 key drivers and conditions for sustainability. So I've done about 8 ex posts. I've looked at over 400 ex posts. On the Valuing Voices website, we have about 100 ex posts that actually involve participant voice, because so few ex post evaluations, so few projects are ever evaluated. As Sanjeev said, less than 1%. Because once donors go home, they close up shop and they say, well, we've done a great job, here you go. But without the local ownership, the resources, the capacities, viable partnerships, as well as adaptive timeframes as you exit, which I'll talk about in a moment, and resilience based on what assumed natural resources, the sustainability prospects are not as high. So again, sustainability is the continuation of benefits from a development intervention after it's been completed, and the resilience to risk. This is the slide you didn't see, where 2/3 of the banks lasted 8 years out. 1/3 didn't, they folded. But one of the interesting things I didn't say last time was the fact that, given the great success, which they felt 2/3, PACT is rather a rational actor, 2/3 of the banks surviving without any further assistance. It was a women's empowerment and village bank project. They went and they replicated it in 12 countries. They were so delighted that many were sustained. The great success is the 10% of the new banks, which was really phenomenal. And so here we go again. You'll remember it because I'm repeating it again. So one of the things that we've learned through ex post evaluation, a brilliant professor at Tufts, B. Rogers, did this seminal study in 4 countries, including India, and found that there are really the top 4 drivers of sustainability is their ownership. Who is benefiting enough from the intervention to sustain it locally? Who is demanding it? If it's not demanded, it will not be sustained. Resources. How is it being resourced once the donors go home? The resources often go away. Are there financial, technical, in kind, and other resources that the local context, the national government, the local government, local private sector, the communities themselves are marshalling? Capacities. What are the project knowledge and skills to be transferred to national stakeholder partners to sustain the intervention? How will training be sustained for specific sectoral behavioral change? When new entrants in Nigeria was suddenly surrounded by, easily 70 or 80 children, and I realized in this maternal child health and food security project, how were they being trained about best breastfeeding practices after a 5-year project? When they become mothers or fathers, how would that knowledge be passed on? Partnerships, what continued knowledge and skills from what partners are needed to sustain the intervention, local contracting and so forth. And one of the things that's incredibly important is that global development projects, as you all know, as the recipients or victims of, or beneficiaries of, is that they are often implemented on fixed timeframes, which is stark raving crazy because just because we have enough money for 2, 3, 5, 10 years doesn't mean that it's ready. It's like saying to someone, you have 3 months to lose 50 pounds. And at 4 months, irrespective of whether they lost 50 pounds or not, the project or the support will end. So, there's much more needed to be adaptive in terms of the time frame, and also drop some activities that are not valued by local participants. And resilience. One of the huge issues in sustainability evaluation these days is really looking at the assumptions we're making about the natural resources that our projects are relying on. How at risk are they, and how long should the resources be assumed to last? So I've got three slides from 3 different perspectives. One is we can't assume sustainability, right? USA did this study of 6 or 7 countries, and they looked at, they took sustainability of water, sanitation, and hygiene as their really most important aim. And they looked at they did this series of ex posts, and they're sobering, right? The achievements have largely not endured, especially in countries with higher levels of poverty. And rural water systems that delivered safe water to households have fallen into disrepair, right? And so this little girl trying to get water is suddenly going to go with their moms and sisters and aunties to go and pull water out the old-fashioned way with ropes and pails. This is what we don't want to see in terms of sustainability, and certainly you and your planning departments don't as well. And so this is the adaptive timeframes. One of the things that we always ask people to do if they're trying to foster sustainability is to actually phase over during implementation, so that the capacities they've tested if it's actually going to be sustained, or it looks likely, or what's missing. Are there partnerships that are missing? Was there no thought of the water table, in this case, of the natural system? So these poor people gathered local resources. These women would gather local resources, call partners such as the government to purchase a local pump with locally available spare parts, not some fancy pump from abroad. Is suggesting next time we've learned to invest in local resources made with available spare parts, and capacity strengthening for those that are supposed to maintain it, and examine resilience to drought by revisiting the water table. Three stories really. So this is from the perspective of Ethiopian donors, the government, and the Swedish Red Cross. So I went to look at, did a final evaluation with projected sustainability. I didn't get to do it ex post, but I was tasked with looking at what is likely to last. So the government really wanted to give people, if you look at the table, they wanted to give them oxes, and they wanted to give them dairy cows and sheep and goats, and they wanted to give them bees. And they were giving, Swedish Red Cross was providing financial resources to provide credit to these people, like this lovely lady selling her teff. And they were really rather frustrated. Why aren't more people taking the loans? And the government was aptly determined that these are all key activities for Ethiopians. But when we asked the participants themselves about what they could sustain without the support of partners such as the government, because they were phasing out of this area and are going to a different sub-region. So the men and the women were all saying, well, the lowest risk is resources that we can sustain ourselves. That's poultry. The government gave virtually no poultry. But next is, sheep and goats. We probably could, keep them alive, and we're willing to take on the credit to try and keep them alive. But virtually no one wanted oxen or dairy, no matter how good it would have been for the Ethiopian economy and for the malnutrition of children, because they didn't value the voices of local participants to ask, what do you need? What do you want? What are you willing to sustain, rather than what will fulfill our national plan as Ethiopia's future success. Yeah, so a lot of valuing voices is listening. So emerging sustainability, again, it's how did people sustain things all by themselves? So picked some credit, and I'll do number 2 first. So the village banks, one of the things that shocked PACT was the fact that locals were offering trainings in how to do village banking, and they wanted to get paid. It was a brilliant idea. No wonder 10% of the banks grew, because there was a built-in cost recovery model for the trainers. They went to communities, they said, I'm happy to teach you, pay me whatever the fee that they set, and the community happily paid, and PACT was shocked that the women weren't volunteering these trainings onward, whereas I thought it was absolutely, completely self-sustaining and a wonderful idea, and we should always plan on it. The example from Niger is participants about ownership and resources. Participants valued a health clinic that was built by the project, and they did it in 2 ways, completely not part of the exit planning of an otherwise excellent project by CRS. One is they said, we're going to set up community tithing. So every single time there's a wedding, baptism, or funeral, every single guest that comes here is going to put in 1,000 sefa, which was about $1.50, into our little bucket. And that bucket will go cover the cost of the maintenance of the health clinic, because we so value the health clinic. And even more wonderfully, the chiefs and the council of elders, which included women, said, well, how do we incentivize the use of the health clinic? Because they learned that maternal mortality and child mortality, as Michael mentioned, was a horrific problem, and they wanted to avoid it in their communities. And the presence of the new health clinic had really decreased it dramatically. And they said, we know. So the first time after the project ended, a few months after the project ended, we were told that a woman gave birth at home. The council got wind of this. They sent someone to round up her, their child, and the husband, and they locked these 3 people in the health clinic. It was a massive disincentive. And they said, well, for a week, it wasn't just briefly, it was for an entire week. And they said, anyone else who would like to give birth at home will be locked in the health clinic for a week. So all the husbands of these 3 large communities were bringing their wives to the health clinic weeks before delivery due dates because they didn't want to be locked in the health clinic. Now, maternal child health people could be horrified. I think it's an absolutely brilliant incentive. And it was all locally generated, no cost, 100% effectiveness, because we went to look at the maternal child health mortality data. There was one lady who had died in 3 years, and it was because she was hemorrhaging and she had to be transferred to another hospital far away where she passed away. But no one had died in that village, thanks to the brilliant ownership and resources that the community had instigated. So, questions, comments? Now that you've seen our lovely slides, I'll stop the share.
Indra, thank you so much. And it's remarkable. I think it's 1:45 or 1:50 a.m. Pull this off. Terrific. Before I turn it to Sampachi for a quick question, you have a chance to speak to a number of state leaders here. I think even as a funder myself, at the project level, as you pointed out, we struggle with it. But I think in a sense, the bigger prize is if working at a state system, if there are capacities to think about sustainability up front, if that can be sort of, I don't want to use the word institutionalized, but some process of bringing that much more clearly to the fore. Any thoughts on actually building capacities for upfront thinking about sustainabilities in institutional structures like state governments or community governments?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, simply asking the question, sustainability of what, for how long, and how do we know it hasn't changed? Right? Because communities are constantly adapting to change. Health centers are constantly adapting to change. And so having feedback loops where people are scorecard, reporting back, how are things working, checking in, reading them, going to go visit, building capacities, frankly, it depends on a great deal of interest and faith that communities are smart. If you think communities are imbecilic, you will not have faith in them. And just because they're illiterate, as many northern donors who don't consider participants as anything more, frankly, than implementing the projects they have designed for them, rather than involving the participant, the communities, and the countries in the design of their own projects. And frankly, why isn't India evaluating the effectiveness of the Gates work? Why aren't many countries saying, gosh, your aid really hasn't been terrific. We'd really like to change the terms of this. That's my wish. So, a great deal more peer relationships would be, I think, very beneficial, both within India and internationally.
Thank you, Indra. It's great. Thank you so much for staying away and speaking to us. So one thing that we looked at for sustainability of these interventions, what generally we are doing at a state level is that one is that building some community institutions, because they remain there. The programs can come and go, but you have those institutions remain. But we also have to have a system of continuously working with those community institutions. So we have a concept called support organizations. What are the support organizations? For example, we have this SRES, State Rural Employment Society. It's a support organization for village employment councils in the state, so that continuously that village employment councils can see and sustain that work what they are doing. So, and I like your 6 key drivers, where you definitely require some resources and a lot of ownership. So the second part is that what we also understood very important for the states to drive a sustainable change is that political supportability. Political supportability means how actually the despite or in spite of a lot of challenges, how actually there is a continuous support on these initiatives. So it's a very important thing. So this is again there also we need to really work on it. But my question here is that for all these projects, for these interventions, there are some key people, who would be like who would be providing that leadership, or suppose what happens, for example, Dr. Umalong is here. She is doing something somewhere and she has been transferred to somewhere. How actually continue that, the work? Always this anxiety will be there, whether this would continue the way it has to be continued. So what is that, I want to ask you, like, what is that way actually we can handle this? Because it's something that maybe some thoughts on that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. It is, the capacities, continuing the capacities is imperative. And I taking the CRS Niger, the demand for and the belief in the value of the health clinic was at the local level. CRS and Helen Keller and CARE had created a demand for those services that they would turn themselves into pretzels, maintaining that health center. It cannot be in the sustainability. I keep publishing, I keep presenting, even if it's 2 a.m. I don't mind. I'm a night owl, but I keep trying to transfer this capacity onward to younger evaluators, to national evaluators, so others can continue to do this. It can never be in the hands of one person, and so the greater devolution of the responsibility to the local level. I love the idea of having technology where someone is rating the quality of the water system in their community, and they get to send a text message, or they get to click on something on whatever, Facebook or whatever applications you guys are using, to say what is the feedback, and then to get the feedback loops. The problem with most donors is the feedback loops are one way. We do evaluations and we never tell them what happened. We do monitoring and we fix things, but there's very little feedback going back to communities and saying, so I heard you have problems with your pump, it doesn't work. You're resorting to pull water in pails out of the well. We hear you, and we're going to have, in Ethiopia, they created local agents that would be the in-between people. Local university students were seconded to villages, and they would be the point person to make sure the feedback loop was two-way. Yeah. So the more we devolve the responsibility and the capacities, the more we can increase the demand and the sustainability. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello, ma'am. That was a great presentation. Yes. I just, regarding the presentation which I have just made just now, actually I'm a gynecologist by profession. Right now I'm holding the post of Joint Director MI. Like Sir rightly said, it is very difficult for me to leave the place where I'm working now because I'm so attached to the place. And that kind of an ownership is already there. I don't want that hospital or the institute which I'm holding now to suffer. There are certain projects which is running till now, so I just want those projects to be completed. Since I am a gynecologist, I just want to know from you, madam, I think you have done quite a lot of work in your project which I've already highlighted. It's regarding locking inside the house of a pregnant woman along with the family members if they refuse to go to the hospital for the delivery. I just want to know from you whether this is the usual practice in that area, or is it some kind of a law which is already there, number one. And number two, I don't know whether is it right, whether we are some kind of a violation to the reproductive rights of a woman. The woman has a right to choose to deliver where, which place, when, and at the same time to plan a family. And another one, the same thing with whatever is happening in our side. Supposing if there is any death in any of the house, or if there is any such kind of thing that some women are being locked inside the house, I'm pretty sure there will be quite a lot of pressure groups who will be coming forward and making quite a lot of noise. So I just want to hear it from you, whether that kind of law or act in that particular area where your project is going on, I would like you to share us some kind of an information, or what is the way forward to it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so very much, Doctor. They locked them in the health clinic, not in their homes, but in the health clinic. And it was such a disincentive, mostly, frankly, for the men. The women weren't particularly bothered by being, as far as we interviewed them, by being locked in the health clinic. They were just absolutely delighted that their men were finally compelled to care so much about safe delivery. And this is not to say that they can't deliver safely at home, but when we saw the maternal mortality rates before the clinic, then we saw the maternal mortality rates during the project, which were decreasing. And then we saw zero maternal mortality rates after the project left, when they started this incentive project, this incentive system to make sure that the men would bring their women, or the women would go to the health clinic themselves. Otherwise, they feared being locked in the health clinic for a week with their spouses and infants. It was just to illustrate a brilliant local system that worked in that context. This is not to say that all people should be locked in health clinics. It was just to illustrate that communities know how to sustain results in ways that we could not imagine.